She wiped the last pane of glass clean before she let anyone see how badly her hands were shaking. High on a wobbling aluminum ladder propped against the front windows of the lobby of the Wexford Hotel, in the first cold of a Chicago winter, Rosalind Hartley dragged her rag across the wide window, her gray apron stained with water and dust. She was 28 years old. In her pocket, she had exactly $12, a dismissal notice torn in half, and a card her daughter had scribbled with a drawing of 3 people, though now only 2 of them were left. An hour earlier, they had accused her of stealing something she had never once touched. An hour from now, her 6-year-old daughter would ask why her mother had come home early, and she would have no idea what to say about the hospital bill she could no longer find any way to pay. She had no idea that down below, a man was looking up at her. On the stone sidewalk, amid the rush of people, a figure in a black coat stood perfectly still, as though the whole city had to bend its movement around him. Lincoln Marsh never raised his head for anyone. The men who had once forced him to look up had learned that it was the last thing they ever did, and yet now he was watching the woman on the ladder, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the painfully honest housekeeper who had just returned his mother's watch days before. Neither of them knew that on this bitter morning, along with the little girl waiting at home, 3 fates had just irrevocably intertwined, and not one of them would ever be the same again. If you believe that kindness can change a person's entire fate, please leave a like and share this story with someone who needs a little more hope today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can walk together through the next journeys of healing. 6 weeks before that fateful morning, Rosalind Hartley was still a name no one at the Wexford Hotel cared enough to remember. She worked as a housekeeper on the 18th floor, where guests paid as much for one night's room as she earned in an entire month, and she had grown used to becoming invisible among hallways, carpeted so thickly that footsteps made no sound. She pushed her cart of clean towels past numbered doors, knocked 3 times, waited, then stepped inside to clean the rooms of strangers, and most of the time, no one looked her directly in the eyes even once. She didn't mind it. Being invisible had its advantages. When people didn't see you, they also didn't see how calloused your hands had become, or how worn down your shoes were, with pieces of cardboard tucked inside for padding. She was 28 years old, and she had learned that some things were best kept to yourself. Her husband had died 2 years earlier. People told her she would get used to it, that time would soften everything. But no one told her that time didn't pay the rent, didn't cover hospital bills, and didn't lull a child back to sleep on the nights when that child woke because she couldn't breathe. After the funeral, she had 2 things left in this world that were worth waking up for every morning. One was her little girl. The other was a silent promise that no matter what happened, her daughter would never know how frightened her mother truly was. Daisy had just turned 6 years old. She had softly curling brown hair like her father's, wide eyes that always stayed open as though the world still held something new and wondrous enough to surprise her, and a habit of drawing pictures on any piece of paper she could find. She drew houses with chimneys, plump round cats, and a great many suns, always smiling suns. Inside her small chest, Daisy carried a heart that wasn't perfect. The doctors called it a congenital defect, a place in her heart that hadn't closed properly the way it should have, and they said she needed surgery. But surgery wasn't something that could be done right away. Daisy needed to be strong enough, needed to gain more weight, needed a stable enough condition to withstand the operation, and most important of all, her mother needed enough money. Those were the 2 appointments that kept being pushed farther into the future, and Rosa lived in the space between them the way a person lives in a room where the ceiling sinks lower every day. The hospital debt from checkups, from observation stays, from prescriptions she never dared skip even once, grew thicker month by month. She took extra shifts, accepted additional floors, stood outside cleaning the front windows on days when they were short of workers, and she never refused any job as long as it brought in a few more dollars. The only person at the Wexford who regularly looked straight at her was Gerald, the floor manager, but his stare wasn't the kind anyone wanted to receive. He had a habit of inspecting rooms she had just finished cleaning, and then finding some fault no matter what. A towel fold that wasn't perfectly straight, a watermark on the mirror, anything that gave him an excuse to speak to her in the voice he reserved for people he believed stood beneath him. He called her the room girl, in a way that made those 2 words sound like a reminder of her place. She swallowed it all. She swallowed it for her child. She had done the math carefully. A humiliating job was still better than no job at all, and pride was a luxury a debt-ridden single mother couldn't always afford. But there was one place where fear and exhaustion couldn't follow her inside. It was the small apartment on the third floor of an old building, where every evening she came home and pushed the door open, and Daisy would come rushing out with a sheet of paper in her hand. That night, the little girl had drawn 3 people standing side by side beneath a smiling sun, 2 grown-ups and 1 child, though Rosa knew very well there were only 2 of them left now. She didn't correct her daughter. She gathered the child into her arms, kissed her brown hair, and they both laughed when Daisy explained that she had added a cat in the corner of the picture too, so the house wouldn't feel so empty. In that moment, between 4 cramped walls fragrant with the smell of hot soup, Rosa allowed herself to believe that everything would somehow be all right. She didn't yet know that only a few weeks later, an old watch would change everything. While Rosa was wiping the windows on the 18th floor, a dozen or so blocks away, on the highest floor of a tower made of steel and dark glass, there was a room very few people were allowed to enter, and even fewer left with everything they had brought in still intact. Lincoln Marsh sat at the head of a long black wooden table, his hands folded together on its surface, silent. He wasn't the kind of man who filled empty space with words. He let silence do that work for him, and it did the work very well, because around that table, 6 men in expensive suits were sitting straighter than usual, and not one of them dared to be the first to speak. People called Lincoln Marsh by many names, but on paper, he was the owner of a corporation that controlled the city's tallest buildings, its most expensive parcels of land, and a chain of hotels of which the name Wexford was only 1 brick in the wall. That was the surface people were allowed to see. Beneath that surface were streams of money moving along roads the law could never fully shine a light on, and everyone seated in that room understood that real power didn't lie in buildings. It lay in knowing exactly who was lying to you. Tonight, one of them was lying. The man sitting 3 seats away from Lincoln, whose name was Foster, had managed part of the corporation's money flow for 4 years, and in those 4 years, he had learned everything except one thing, that Lincoln Marsh always knew the true numbers before he ever walked into the room. Lincoln didn't shout. He merely pushed a thin file across the tabletop toward Foster, and the file came to a stop directly in front of him like an accusation that didn't need a single written word. "Do you want to say it yourself, or shall I say it for you?" Lincoln said, his voice even and low, without the slightest ripple of emotion, and it was that very calmness that sent a coldness crawling up the back of Foster's neck. Foster began to explain, his voice stumbling, numbers, reasons, borrowed names used to conceal the money that had disappeared. But Lincoln only sat and listened with the patience of a man who already knew the ending and was simply waiting to see how long it would take the other man to lead himself there. When Foster stopped, the whole room went so quiet that the ticking of the clock on the wall could be heard. Lincoln rose, fastened 1 button of his suit jacket, and walked around behind the seated men, slowly, 1 step at a time, until he stopped behind Foster's chair. "I'm not punishing you for the money," he said, almost gently. "I can make that money back in a week. I'm punishing you because you thought I wouldn't see." He didn't need to say another word. By the next morning, Foster would lose everything he had in a completely legal way. Every contract, every account, every door that had once opened for him would close, and he would understand that being erased from the game by Lincoln Marsh was more terrifying than any threat. But that night, after the room had emptied, Lincoln remained there alone in the dark with a concern far greater than Foster. Foster was only a small, greedy man. The real problem was that for the past several months, information that should have been known only to a very small circle of Lincoln's most trusted people kept leaking out, landing exactly in the hands of those he didn't want to have it. Someone inside his closest circle was selling him out. He didn't yet know who it was, but he knew that one of those suspicious, dirty money channels wound through the books of several hotels in the chain, and Wexford was the name appearing more often than any other. So the next morning, instead of sending someone under him to inspect the place as usual, Lincoln Marsh booked a room himself under a name no one knew, and stepped through the revolving door of the Wexford Hotel. He had come there to find a traitor. He had no idea he was about to meet someone who would make him remember what he had buried for 20 years. The premium corner room on the 18th floor was the most expensive room in the entire Wexford Hotel, and that morning Rosa was assigned to clean it as she did every day, without having the slightest idea who the man was who had left it only a few hours earlier. She pushed her cart inside, knocked 3 times out of habit even though she knew the room was empty, then began her work with a rhythm so deeply memorized that her hands could keep moving while her mind thought about something else. She was thinking about Daisy, about tonight's dose of medicine, about next week's follow-up appointment that she still didn't know how she was going to pay for, when her hand touched a small object tucked into the gap of the armchair beside the window. She pulled it out. It was a wristwatch, an old one, with faint scratches across the glass face, plating worn away around the rim to reveal the darkened metal beneath, and a leather strap cracked by the years. It wasn't shiny or showy like the things guests on this floor usually carried, but Rosa had once stood long enough behind the counter of a pawn shop during the hardest days of her life to recognize at once that an old watch like this, the right kind of old watch, could be worth more than a whole year of her wages. She stood very still for a long time with it in her palm. The room was so quiet that she could hear her own heart beating. In her mind, a voice rose very softly and very reasonably, telling her that the man who had left this behind was surely so rich he would never even remember it, that if she took it away, the hospital debt could be wiped clean in a single afternoon, that Daisy might be able to have surgery sooner, that no one would know, no one at all. Her hand tightened around the watch. She thought of her little girl sitting at home with the babysitter, thought of that small chest rising and falling every night, and for one long, frightening moment, she truly considered it. But then she thought of something else. She thought of the evening Daisy had drawn 3 people beneath a smiling sun, and explained that she had added a cat so the house wouldn't feel so empty. And Rosa asked herself what kind of mother she would become if she taught her child with hands that had just taken something that didn't belong to her. She didn't have much left in this world, but what she did have, she didn't want to trade at that price. Rosa placed the watch in the pocket of her apron, went down to the front desk, and reported that she had found an item a guest had left behind in the room, asking that it be returned directly to its owner so she could be sure it wouldn't be misplaced again. She didn't do it to be praised. She did it because it was the only way she knew how to sleep peacefully. Someone called up to the room, and only a few minutes later, the man came downstairs. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat, moving with the manner of someone who never had to hurry because the world was always the one made to wait for him, and when his eyes met hers, Rosa suddenly felt herself wanting to take a step back without understanding why. She held out the watch, briefly explained where she had found it, and said she hadn't touched anything else in the room. Lincoln Marsh looked at the watch lying in her palm, and for the first time that morning, something shifted almost imperceptibly in his otherwise unreadable face. He took it from her very gently, almost carefully, the way someone holds something that can't be replaced with money, something that, once lost, no amount of money in the world could ever buy back. He didn't say thank you right away. He raised his eyes to her and looked at her for a very long time, so long that she began to feel uncomfortable. And in that look there wasn't the scrutiny of a wealthy owner toward a housekeeper, but something altogether different. A recognition, as though she had accidentally touched a door that had been locked inside him for 20 years. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low and slow. "Rosalind Hartley," she answered. He gave one very faint nod, tucked the watch into the breast pocket of his coat, directly over his heart, and turned away. But Rosa noticed in time that this cold man had just looked at her in a way no one had looked at her for many years, and she had no idea that she had just passed a test she'd never even known she was being given. Lincoln Marsh returned to his room, closed the door, and stood for a very long time by the window with the old watch in his hand, letting something he had believed was buried deep long ago rise from the bottom of memory. 20 years earlier, he had still been a boy living in cramped rented rooms on the edge of the city, and his mother had been a housekeeper. She worked for a wealthy family in a grand house that young Lincoln had never been allowed to enter through the front door, a woman whose hands were always rough from cleaning water and soap, yet always warm when she placed them on his forehead each night. She didn't have much to give her son besides 2 things. One was a love that never ran dry. The other was a stubborn belief that no matter how poor a person might be, they could still keep their honesty, and that it was a kind of treasure no one had the right to take away. This watch had belonged to her. It was the only thing of any real value she had ever owned, something passed down from an earlier generation, and she kept it as a reminder that their family had once known a time of dignity and decency. Then one day, in that grand house, an expensive piece of jewelry disappeared, and they needed someone to blame. They didn't look for the real culprit. They simply chose the easiest person to accuse, the one who had no money to hire a lawyer, no one to stand up for her, no voice at all in their world. They chose the housekeeper. His mother was dismissed in humiliation. Every other door closed against her because of the name, thief, a stain she could never wash away. And though she had never touched that piece of jewelry even once, No one was willing to believe a poor woman. Young Lincoln watched his mother waste away, not from illness, but from shame, from the feeling of being judged by the whole world for a crime she had never committed, and she passed away a few years later, carrying that injustice into the grave, before anyone ever gave her a single word of apology. Before she died, she took the watch off her wrist, placed it in her son's palm, and told him never to become someone who turned his face away from the powerless, never to stand on the side of those who used power to crush people who had nothing with which to defend themselves. Lincoln had grown up and built an entire empire. He had become a man no one dared lie to, no one dared look down on, but through all those 20 years, he had never taken off his mother's final words. He punished without mercy those who oppressed the people beneath them. He never spared those who borrowed their strength to bully the weak, and he kept that watch beside him like a compass pointing toward the man his mother had wanted him to become. And yet that morning, a poor housekeeper, a woman clearly desperate enough that her hands had trembled while holding something that could have saved her entire life, had chosen to return it untouched. She didn't know what it meant to him. She didn't know she was being tested. She had simply refused to take something that didn't belong to her, even when no one in the world would have known if she had. And it was that uncalculated honesty, with no performance, no stage, no hunger for reward, that touched the exact place inside Lincoln Marsh that he had believed had turned to stone over the past 20 years. He looked down at the watch in his hand, then looked out the window toward the glittering panes of the building, and for the first time in a very long while, a human name settled in his mind not as a link in an investigation, but as something he didn't want to forget. Rosalind Hartley. He quietly committed that name to memory, never knowing that in only a few days, that very woman would be accused of the same crime his mother had once been forced to carry. A few days after the morning she returned the watch, Rosa kept working as usual, without knowing that somewhere beyond her sight, gears had already begun to turn in order to grind her down. That afternoon, while pushing her towel cart past a room at the end of the 18th floor hallway, she accidentally caught sight of Gerald standing inside, his back turned toward the door, speaking on the phone in a lowered voice, utterly unlike the arrogant tone he always used with the staff. She only heard a few broken sentences, something about everything already being arranged, about a name she couldn't quite catch, and about the books being clean before anyone had a chance to look too closely. He also shoved a thick envelope into the inner pocket of his coat the moment he heard the wheels of her cart rolling by. Rosa didn't understand any of it. She only found it strange, because what business would a floor manager have whispering like a man hiding something, and that envelope was unusually thick. But she was a housekeeper. She had grown used to seeing many things she wasn't allowed to question, so she lowered her head, pushed her cart onward, and let it pass like everything else. She didn't know that accidental moment would later become the most important thing she had ever witnessed. What she knew even less was that Gerald had seen her pass by, and in his mind, she had just become a problem that needed to be swept away before it had the chance to grow. Gerald wasn't acting alone. He was following orders, and the order was to make that room girl disappear from the hotel as quickly as possible, in a way that would leave no one willing to defend her, a way that would stain her so badly that even if her voice rose later, no one would believe it anymore. He chose the oldest and most poisonous blow that people with power still use to destroy those who had nothing. The next morning, an important guest on the 18th floor reported that a valuable item had gone missing from the room, and Gerald, wearing a falsely grave expression, immediately pointed straight at the housekeeper assigned to that floor. He had someone search Rosa's personal locker, and there, between her faded coat and the wool gloves she still wore on winter mornings, they found the very item that had gone missing, hidden so clumsily that it should have made anyone suspicious. But no one wanted to be suspicious. People only wanted a quick, tidy answer, and a poor housekeeper was always the most convenient answer of all. Rosa stood in the staff room, looking at the item in Gerald's hand as the cold went through her whole body, and she said she had never touched it, that she didn't know why it was in her locker, that she had returned an entire watch worth many times more only a few days earlier, so how could it make any sense for her to steal now? But Gerald only curled one corner of his mouth, and that smirk told her the truth had never mattered here. He spoke loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear, saying that people like her always carried an honest-looking face, that this was exactly what made them dangerous, and that the Wexford Hotel had no place for a thief. No one spoke up for her. The co-workers she had greeted every morning all lowered their faces and looked away, because defending her meant placing themselves in Gerald's line of fire, And everyone had a family, a rent payment, a reason to remain silent. They handed her a termination notice, cold and final, ending everything with nothing more than a signature. Rosa held that paper, and what filled her mind wasn't outrage, but a silent panic, because she wasn't thinking about her honor in that moment. She was thinking about Daisy, about the doses of medicine, about the hospital bills, about the surgery that had now been pushed farther away than ever. She tore the paper in half, not because she was angry, but because she needed her hands to do something so they would stop trembling. Then she walked outside, took up the last window cleaning task they still forced her to finish before leaving, climbed onto the aluminum ladder set against the hotel's front facade, and began to wipe the glass. News of the housekeeper, accused of theft, spread faster than Rosa had imagined, because in the world of rumors, a story about a thief is always passed along with more eagerness than any truth. And within only a few days, that stain had crept into places she never expected it to reach. It reached the ears of Daisy's paternal family. The Whitmores were a wealthy and proud family, the parents of Rosa's late husband. People who had never truly accepted her into their bloodline. People who, from the day their son died, had quietly believed that a poor woman who cleaned rooms for a living wasn't fit to raise the only grandchild who carried their family's blood. For the past 2 years, they had watched from a distance, waited, and silently gathered every piece of evidence for the thing they had already decided in their minds, that Rosa would eventually fail, that she couldn't manage it, that sooner or later they would have a reason to take Daisy home. And now that reason had arrived, wrapped in a story so perfect that they didn't need to invent anything more. A mother who had just lost her job, who had been branded a thief, who was buried under debt, and who was raising a sick child who needed surgery without even having the money to pay for it. They hired the best lawyer, and they filed for guardianship, arguing that for the child's own good, Daisy should live in a home with the proper conditions for medical care and a stable future, not beside a mother sinking into crisis. When Rosa received the court papers, she read them alone in the small kitchen, after making certain Daisy was sound asleep, and she had to grip the edge of the table just to stay on her feet. They didn't only mean to take her job from her, or take her dignity from her. They meant to take the only thing left that made her life have meaning. Fear came over her, not violently, but silently, cold and deep. The fear of a mother who realized that everything she had sacrificed, every extra shift, every sleepless night, every humiliation she had swallowed to keep her wages, could be erased by a stack of papers and a team of lawyers, simply because she had no money to fight back. She sat for a very long time in the darkness of the kitchen, not sobbing aloud, only letting her tears fall silently onto the documents, because she had learned long ago how to cry without making a sound, so the little girl in the next room would never wake because of her mother's tears. The next morning, she didn't let Daisy see even a trace of the night before. She walked into her daughter's room with a smile carefully placed back on her lips, woke her in the gentle voice she used every morning, brushed her soft brown curls, and listened as the child told her about last night's dream, where there was a cat that knew how to fly. Daisy was still carefree the way every 6-year-old child deserved to be carefree. She knew nothing about courtrooms, about lawyers, about the grandparents who wanted to take her away, and Rosa swore in her heart that she would never have to know, that even if the sky fell down, her little girl would only see her mother smiling. That morning, after feeding her daughter, Rosa held Daisy for a very long time, longer than usual, pressing her cheek against the child's hair and closing her eyes to memorize the warmth of those small arms wrapped around her neck, as though she wanted to carve it into memory, in case there came a day when she would no longer be allowed to hold her child that way. Daisy giggled and asked why Mommy was hugging her so long today, and Rosa only answered that it was because today, Mommy loved her just a little bit more. The little girl nodded as if she understood, then ran off to get paper and pencils so she could show her mother the flying cat. And Rosa stood there watching her go, carrying on her shoulders a despair she couldn't share with anyone, and for the first time in her life, she didn't know where to find the strength to keep moving forward. While Rosa was drowning in her own silent despair, on the other side of the city, the investigation Lincoln Marsh had been quietly conducting was closing in around a single name, and that name was Gerald. The dirty money leaking outward, the numbers that didn't match in the Wexford Hotel's books, all of it led back to one man, a floor manager who had believed he was too insignificant for someone like Lincoln to notice. Lincoln's people discovered that Gerald had been embezzling money from the hotel for quite some time, and worse than that, He had taken outside money to act as an inside man, opening doors that should have stayed closed, passing along information that should have remained buried. And as Lincoln peeled back each layer of paperwork, he found one detail that made him stop for a very long time. Only a few days earlier, Gerald himself had staged the dismissal of a housekeeper on an accusation of theft, and that housekeeper's name was Rosalind Hartley. Lincoln didn't need much time to understand what had happened. He had read enough of the file to know the missing item had been found in her locker in a way so clumsy it was almost ridiculous. He knew that a woman who had just returned to him a watch worth more than everything she owned would never steal some small trinket. And he understood that she had been framed, chosen as a scapegoat in the same way his mother had been chosen 20 years before. Something inside his chest, something that had long ago turned to stone, suddenly grew hot. Lincoln summoned Gerald to a meeting room in the hotel, and he walked in with a mixture of servility and curiosity, the look of a man who didn't yet know what he was about to face, until he realized who the man seated at the head of the table was, and every trace of blood drained from his face. Lincoln had arranged for Rosa to be there as well, standing quietly in one corner of the room, because he wanted her to witness the truth being brought into the open with her own eyes. He wanted her to know she wasn't losing her mind, that she had been right from the beginning. Lincoln didn't shout, didn't slam his fist on the table, and didn't need any of those things. He simply placed one folder after another onto the tabletop. Every document proving the money Gerald had stolen, every call he had made, every dirty dollar he had accepted, and each sheet of paper that landed on the table pushed Gerald one step closer to the edge. Gerald began to stammer denials, then stammer explanations, then finally stammer pleas. But Lincoln only watched him with a calm so cold it chilled the blood, the gaze of a man who had already decided the other man's fate and was only waiting for him to understand it. "You chose the wrong person to destroy," Lincoln said, his voice low and steady, each word falling like a block of stone. "A mother raising a sick child, with nothing to defend herself. You thought she was the easiest person in this building to bully. You were wrong. She is the most protected." Then he told Gerald exactly what was about to happen to him, not with threats, but with facts. By morning, every one of his accounts would be frozen, every contract canceled. Every connection that had once propped him up would turn its back on him. The file on everything he had done would be sent to precisely the places it needed to go. And from the moment he walked out of that room, he would no longer be able to find a decent job, an open door, or a single person willing to stand on his side anywhere in the city. Gerald collapsed to his knees and begged for one chance, but Lincoln had already risen and fastened his jacket button, a sign that, for him, the conversation was over. "A chance," he said softly, "is what you had, and you used it to frame an innocent woman." He signaled for his men to take Gerald away, and when the door closed behind him, the silence in the room hung heavy as a sentence just pronounced. Then Lincoln turned to Rosa, and this time his eyes were different, no longer carrying the coldness he had given Gerald, but something far gentler. "Your name has been cleared," he said. "There will be an official announcement that you're innocent, sent to every place that needs to know. You never did anything wrong." Rosa stood there, her hands still trembling, not from fear anymore, but because, for the first time in many days, someone had believed her. What Rosa didn't know was that right after the afternoon when her false accusation was cleared, Lincoln Marsh quietly did something he didn't tell anyone about. He had people look carefully into her circumstances, and when he learned about Daisy, about the little girl's imperfect heart, about the surgery that kept being delayed because there wasn't enough money, about the hospital debt that had piled so high, a mother working as a housekeeper couldn't pay it off, even if she tried for the rest of her life. He did what power and wealth allowed him to do in silence. He paid for everything. He wiped out the old debt, paid in advance for the surgery, and every expense that might arise, and arranged for the hospital to contact the family about setting a date for the operation as soon as the little girl's condition was strong enough. But he gave very clear instructions that his name was not to appear anywhere in those papers, that everything had to be done through an anonymous charitable fund, and that no one, especially Rosa, was to know who stood behind it. He didn't do it to be thanked. He did it because a poor woman had once returned to him the most precious thing in his life, without asking for anything, and because deep inside, he knew that if, 20 years earlier, someone had done the same for his mother, his whole life would have been different. A few days later, he summoned Rosa, and this time it wasn't to speak about Gerald or the past, but to make her an offer. He said he knew she had just lost her job, that he had work for her if she was willing, Work that would pay her fairly, enough that she wouldn't have to worry about the things she had always worried about. The work was to restore a house. It was an old house in a quiet area on the edge of the city, a house that had stood empty for many years, its walls stained and its floors covered in dust, and he wanted it brought back to life, cleaned, repaired, returned to the warmth of a place where people had once lived. He didn't explain why that house mattered to him, and Rosa didn't ask, because she was used to not questioning the things people didn't want to say. She only noticed that when he spoke of that house, there was a very faint softening in this cold man's voice that perhaps even he didn't realize. What she didn't know was that it was the very house where his mother had once worked, the place where his childhood self had stood outside a door he had never been allowed to enter through the front, the place where everything in his life had begun to collapse. Rosa accepted, because she needed the work, and because there was something in the way this man treated her that made her believe the offer was sincere. And so, in the days that followed, she began going to the old house every morning, and Lincoln was often there. He didn't need to come. A man like him had 1,000 things more important to do, and yet he still came, standing quietly as he watched her work, sometimes lifting something heavy with his own hands, sometimes exchanging only a few brief words with her about what should be kept and what should be replaced. Through those quiet mornings, something began to form between two people who had once belonged to worlds so far apart that it had seemed impossible for them ever to touch. They didn't speak much, but they worked beside each other with a silent respect. Neither of them was used to receiving. Rosa realized that the man the whole city feared could be strangely patient, and Lincoln realized that it had been a very long time since anyone had stayed beside him, not out of fear, not out of calculation, but simply because she was doing her work with decency. And just like that, brick by brick, the old house began to live again, at the same time as something inside both their chests. One morning at the old house, when Lincoln arrived and saw Rosa working with dark circles beneath her eyes from lack of sleep, he realized that something heavier than ordinary exhaustion was weighing her down. He wasn't the kind of man who pressed people with questions, but he had his own way, and after a while of silence, she told him about the Whitmore family, about the court papers, about how her late husband's family was using money and lawyers to take Daisy away from her. She told him in the flat, even voice of someone who had already cried herself empty and now had nothing left but resignation. And she said perhaps they were right. Perhaps a mother with nothing like her truly shouldn't keep her child beside her. Lincoln listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished, he said only one thing, that no one had the right to take a mother's child away simply because that mother was poor, and that this would not happen. A few days later, without telling Rosa in advance, Lincoln went to the Whitmore house himself, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore received him in their grand living room, with the pride of people who believed money and bloodline placed them above all judgment. And at first they looked at the stranger with a little disdain, until they realized who was sitting across from them. Lincoln didn't raise his voice. He sat down in the armchair opposite them, placed one hand on his knee, and spoke to them in the same low, calm voice that had made men far more powerful than they were shrink back. He said he knew exactly about the lawsuit they were pursuing, and he also knew the real reason behind it, that this had never been about the child's best interest, but about the fact that they couldn't bear the thought of their granddaughter growing up in a small apartment instead of a mansion. Mr. Whitmore tried to speak in a louder voice, saying this was a family matter and had nothing to do with him, but Lincoln merely looked at him, and that look was enough to make the sentence choke off halfway. Then he continued, still gently, saying that he had had people look very carefully into the Whitmore family, into their investments, into the business ties their reputation depended on, and that all of those things were far more fragile than they imagined. He wasn't making threats. He was simply laying out the truth, one piece at a time, in a way that made the two people sitting before him slowly understand that this man could make the entire comfortable world they were sitting in collapse with only a few phone calls, and that he wouldn't hesitate to do it. "The hospital expenses for your granddaughter have been handled," he said. "The little girl will have her surgery and receive full care, right beside her mother. The argument that her mother isn't capable of raising her no longer has any foundation." He stood up and fastened his jacket button. "You can withdraw the petition quietly, keep your dignity, and still remain the child's grandparents. Or you can continue, and lose far more than a lawsuit." He left that sentence hanging in the elegant room, then politely said goodbye and walked out, not needing to wait for an answer, because he knew the answer had been decided from the moment he sat down. Only a few days later, the Whitmores quietly withdrew their petition. When Rosa received word from the lawyer that the case had ended, she didn't understand why, until she looked at Lincoln and saw something in his eyes that he wasn't saying. She didn't ask what he had done, but in that moment, she began to understand something about this man. The man the whole city called ruthless. The man who could bring someone like Gerald to his knees with only a few sheets of paper, was also the man who had quietly stepped between her and the greatest disaster of her life without ever wanting her to know. She realized that his coldness was only a shell, and behind that shell was something that had been wounded a very long time ago, something so gentle that he had been forced to hide it away after all those years. While everything in Rosa's life seemed to be slowly brightening, the darkness Lincoln had long sensed was finally revealing itself, and it emerged from the place he least expected. For many months, as he searched for the person who had been selling his confidential information to outsiders, Lincoln had still believed the traitor was someone on the outer edge, someone greedy like Gerald, easy to buy and easy to replace. But the truth was far more bitter than that. The man who had betrayed him was Daniel Reyes, his right-hand man, the one who had stood beside him for nearly 10 years, the one he had trusted so deeply that he had allowed him to hold secrets. Even his other closest people weren't allowed to know. Daniel was someone he had once regarded as a younger brother, the only person he had ever let slip behind the guarded shell around him, and that was exactly what made him the sharpest knife capable of stabbing Lincoln in the back. Lincoln discovered this not through a document or a number, but through one small accidental truth that didn't fit, a piece of information only Daniel could have known, that had somehow appeared in the enemy's hands. And when he followed that thread, it led straight back to the person he trusted most. Daniel had sold him out, and he had sold him to Marcus Kane. Kane was an old rival of Lincoln's, a man who hungered for what Lincoln had, but had never been strong enough to take it by his own ability. A man who was always waiting for an opening, a weakness, an opportunity. And now, thanks to Daniel, he had obtained the most valuable thing of all, not numbers or channels, but an understanding of Lincoln Marsh as a man. He knew that the cold man the whole city feared had changed, that a woman named Rosa and a child named Daisy had become something Lincoln cared about. And in the world Kane lived in, caring was the deadliest weakness of all. A person with nothing to lose couldn't be threatened, but a person who had just found something to protect became more fragile than ever. Daniel also gave Kane one piece of information that only the closest circle knew, that little Daisy's heart surgery had finally been scheduled for a specific date and time, that on that very morning, all of Lincoln's attention and worry would be fixed on one place, the hospital, and that it would be the moment when he was most distracted, most vulnerable, and least guarded in years. Kane listened to that with a smile, because he understood its value. He didn't need a fair confrontation. He had never been able to beat Lincoln in a fair confrontation. He needed only the right moment, the moment when even the strongest man became a father, a man holding his breath while waiting for news about one small life, and he decided he would strike on that very day. He planned to deliver the blow precisely when Lincoln believed he was safest, intending to seize his power and turn the very people he wanted to protect into hostages in his own game at the same time. As for Lincoln, he had already sensed that something bad was drawing near. He felt the shift in the air in the way of a man who had lived too long among danger, but he still hadn't grasped the full scale of the trap. And more painful than anything, he still didn't know that the one setting the trap was Daniel. He knew only one thing, that the morning of Daisy's surgery was coming very soon, that it should have been a morning of hope, of one small heart being healed, and yet now something dark was waiting to fall over it. And for the first time in many years, the man who feared nothing in the world felt a true fear rise inside him. Not fear for himself, but fear for the two people who had accidentally become the most precious things he had to lose. The final piece, the one that would change everything, lay inside the memory of the very person no one paid attention to. One afternoon at the old house, when Rosa happened to see Daniel Reyes stop by to exchange a few words with Lincoln before leaving, she suddenly went still, because something in that man's voice and the way he walked touched a memory she had thought she had forgotten. She had heard that voice before. She searched through her mind, and then everything came together like shards of broken glass suddenly fitting into a mirror. That afternoon at the Wexford Hotel, when she had pushed her towel cart past the room at the end of the hallway and caught Gerald whispering on the phone before hurriedly stuffing a thick envelope into his coat, the voice on the other end of the line, the one she had faintly heard through the phone speaker, had been Daniel's voice. Back then she hadn't understood anything. She had only found it strange, then let it pass like everything a housekeeper was forced to let pass. But now, standing in the old house with her heart pounding hard, she understood that the man who had just left wasn't a loyal subordinate, but the one who had been pulling Gerald's strings, the one who had ordered her ruin. And if he was capable of betraying a nameless housekeeper to that degree, then how far could he go in betraying Lincoln? Rosa knew her place very well. She was only a hired worker, with no power, no documents as proof, nothing but a memory and an instinct. She understood all too clearly that accusing Lincoln's most trusted right-hand man was madness, that if she was wrong, she would lose everything that had just been given back to her, and if she was right, she would place herself in the sights of people many times more dangerous than Gerald. A wise person would stay silent. A person whom life had taught that it was best to lower her head would choose not to get involved. But Rosa thought of the man who had quietly stood between her and disaster, the man who had given her dignity back, the man who had saved her right to remain a mother without ever wanting her to know, and she understood that if she stayed silent now, she would never forgive herself. She was no longer the woman who only knew how to swallow everything down just to stay safe. So she went to find Lincoln. She came to him and told him directly what she knew, recounting that afternoon at the Wexford, the voice she had heard, the connection between Gerald and the man he trusted most. Lincoln fell silent. For a moment, he looked at her with doubt, because what she had just said struck at the very pillar he had leaned on for 10 years, and part of him wanted to push it away, to believe she was mistaken. But Rosa didn't retreat. She looked straight into his eyes and said she had no reason to invent such a thing, that she gained nothing from saying it except danger for herself, and that she was telling him, not because she was completely certain, but because she would rather bear the shame of speaking wrongly than let him be stabbed in the back without ever knowing it. It was that naked honesty, that courage of someone who had nothing to lose, and yet still chose to speak up to protect another person, that made Lincoln believe her. He connected her words with the suspicions that had already been smoldering inside him, with the small truth that hadn't fit when he had first noticed it, and the picture appeared before him with chilling clarity. Daniel. It was Daniel. And if Daniel had sold him out, then the day Daniel knew best, the day Lincoln would be weakest, was the morning of Daisy's surgery, which was drawing very close. Lincoln looked at the woman standing before him, the woman who had just risked everything to save him, just as he had once quietly saved her. And in that moment, he understood that between the two of them, it was no longer a matter of employer and hired worker, but of two people who now stood on the same side, ready to shield each other from the storm that was coming. That fateful morning finally arrived, carrying with it the greatest hope and the greatest danger, woven together in the same span of time, in two places far apart. At the hospital, in a quiet, brightly lit area, little Daisy was taken into the operating room. She knew nothing about anything happening in the outside world, nothing about Kane, nothing about Daniel, nothing about the trap being laid, and that was exactly what Rosa had prayed for. Before she was taken away, the little girl still held her mother's hand, still smiled the innocent smile of a child who trusted completely that her mother would always be there, and she whispered a question, asking whether Mommy would be here when she woke up. Rosa kissed her forehead and promised that Mommy would be right here, right outside this door, not going anywhere at all. Then the operating room door closed, leaving the child in the safe hands of the people who would heal her small heart, completely separated from everything unfolding outside. At the same time, in a very different part of the city, inside an empty building, Kane had chosen as the place to strike. Lincoln Marsh walked in, not as prey caught in a trap, but as a man who had already seen the trap ahead of him. Kane had calculated everything based on the assumption that Lincoln would be at the hospital that morning, distracted and off guard, at the easiest moment to strike. But because of Rosa, because of the memory she had been brave enough to speak aloud, Lincoln had turned the game around. He didn't go to the hospital. He had arranged for his own people to protect the outer perimeter of the hospital in silence, ensuring that no danger could reach Rosa or Daisy. And then he went straight to the place where Kane was waiting, going there himself to end everything. When Lincoln appeared in what should have been the perfect trap, the smug smile on Kane's face froze, because he understood at once that something had gone wrong, that his prey knew everything. Daniel stood there beside Kane, and when his eyes met Lincoln's, 10 years of trust collapsed in one silent instant. Lincoln didn't say much. He looked at the man who had once been his right-hand man and asked only one question, whether it had been worth it, and Daniel had no answer. The confrontation broke open quickly and decisively. Kane had prepared his men, and for a few moments, The situation turned chaotic. But Lincoln wasn't someone who could be easily overwhelmed, and the people who were truly loyal to him arrived at exactly the right time. He moved into the fight with the cold composure that had made his name. Every motion deliberate, nothing wasted, no panic. A man fighting not out of rage, but because there were things behind him worth protecting. There was one moment when one of Kane's men tried to strike at him from a hidden angle, and Lincoln blocked the blow, taking it upon himself instead of avoiding it, because avoiding it would have meant letting danger slip past, and he had decided that no danger would be allowed to go any farther. He was hurt, but he didn't take a single step back. One by one, Kane's men were subdued, and in the end, only Kane remained standing there, stripped of all his arrogance, realizing that the game he had spent so long setting up had been lost from the moment one brave housekeeper chose to speak. Lincoln advanced, and Kane backed away until there was nowhere left to go. "You targeted a child and her mother in order to get to me," Lincoln said, his voice lower and colder than ever. "That is the last mistake you're allowed to make in this city." Kane was completely restrained, every path of escape cut off, the underworld empire he had schemed to seize vanishing like smoke in a single morning. As for Daniel, the traitor stood there with the face of a man who had lost everything because of greed and envy, understanding that there was nowhere on earth he could hide from the price of what he had done. When everything ended and stillness returned, Lincoln stood in the middle of the place that had once been meant as his trap, breathing hard, carrying injuries he would hide, and the first thought that rose in his mind wasn't of victory, but of one single question: whether that small heart had been healed by now. While everything was being settled on the other side of the city, Rosa sat on a hard chair in the hospital hallway, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on the closed operating room door, behind which lay the most precious thing in her life. She knew nothing about Kane, about the confrontation, about the fact that the man who had quietly saved her small family was fighting to protect her even at that very moment. Her whole world during those hours had shrunk down to one door and the small light above it, signaling that the surgery was still underway. Time passed with almost cruel slowness. Every time a figure in a white coat walked by, her heart clenched, and every time that figure passed without stopping in front of her, she felt both disappointed and relieved, because no news meant there was still hope. She thought about the promise she had made to her daughter, that Mommy would be right here when she woke up, and she clung to that promise like a lifeline, telling herself that she had to be there, had to smile when Daisy's wide eyes opened, because that was what her little girl trusted completely. She prayed in the way a mother prays, without ceremony, without pretty words, only with whispered pleas repeated over and over in her heart, asking that her child be safe, that small heart be made whole, that Daisy would have many more mornings to draw smiling suns. As she waited, she took out the hospital papers she still kept in her bag, and her eyes stopped on a detail she had never looked at closely before in the middle of all her worry. Every expense, both the old debt and this surgery, had already been paid in advance through an anonymous charitable fund she had never contacted. She had once thought it was a miracle, a nameless stroke of luck she hadn't dared question too much for fear it might disappear. But now, sitting in the stillness of the hospital hallway, with her mind sharpened by anxiety, she began to connect the things she had never connected before. The way Lincoln had given instructions to the hospital, the timing of the debt being cleared just as he entered her life, the tenderness he always tried to hide, all of it suddenly pointed in one direction. Her hands trembled as the truth slowly revealed itself, that the hidden benefactor, the person who had quietly given her child another chance to live, had never been some nameless fund at all. At that exact moment, the operating room door opened, and a doctor stepped out, pulling down his mask, a smile on his tired face. He came to Rosa and spoke the words she had been waiting for with her whole life, that the surgery had been successful, that Daisy's small heart had now been repaired, that the little girl was stable and would recover well, that the hardest part was behind them. For a moment, Rosa couldn't move, as though those words were too immense for her body to hold all at once. Then she broke down crying. She sobbed right there in the hallway, no longer the silent, soundless kind of crying she had practiced for years so her daughter wouldn't hear, but the unrestrained sobs of a mother who had just been given her child back, a cry that carried every sleepless night, every humiliation swallowed, every fear she had borne alone, and now all of it dissolved into tears of joy. She cried for 2 years of forcing herself to be the pillar, for the days when she had thought she couldn't take another step, for the miracle whose name she now knew, and through those tears, One thought rose clearer and stronger than all the rest, that she had to find him, the man who had given her child this morning without ever wanting her to know, and she had to say to him the one thing perhaps no one had ever said to him in his entire life. A few hours later, after Daisy had been moved into a quiet recovery room and was sleeping peacefully, Rosa stepped out into the hallway to take one deep breath, and it was there that she saw him. Lincoln Marsh was standing at the end of the corridor, a short distance from the little girl's door, and he didn't come forward. He simply stood there, looking toward the half-closed door behind which lay the child who had just been healed, with an expression Rosa had never seen on him before, no longer the cold authority of a man the whole city feared, but something hesitant, almost shy, as though an invisible wall were holding him back right at the threshold. She realized he had come as soon as everything was over, still carrying traces of a brutal mourning on his body that he was trying to hide, and she understood that he had come only to make sure the little girl was safe, then planned to leave quietly without letting anyone know. She walked toward him, and when she drew near, she said softly that she knew the person who had paid the hospital bills, the person who had given her daughter this chance, had never been some nameless fund at all. Lincoln didn't deny it. He only turned slightly away, his eyes still fixed on the door of the hospital room, and she saw his jaw tighten. Then he said, his voice lower and rougher than usual, that he had only stopped by to make sure the little girl was all right, and that he should go. When Rosa asked why he didn't go in and visit her for a little while, he stayed silent for a long time, and at last he said the thing he had perhaps never told anyone, that a man like him, with hands that had done the things his hands had done, with the world he lived in, didn't deserve to step into the room of a child as innocent as that. He didn't say it to be comforted, but as a truth he had believed for many years, a sentence he had passed on himself long ago. And in that moment, Rosa looked at him, and she understood that behind this powerful man was a boy who had once stood outside another door, a very long time ago, not allowed to enter. She stepped closer and said only one sentence to him, that his mother would surely be proud, not because of what he had, but because of the man he had chosen to become, because he had done for a poor mother and her child exactly what no one had been willing to do for his mother all those years ago. Those words struck straight into the deepest place he had kept hidden for 20 years. The wound he had believed had hardened over, and for the first time, Rosa saw the eyes of the man who feared nothing in the world fill with tears. He turned his face away, trying to hold on to the last of his composure, but Rosa didn't let him leave. She reached out, took his hand, and gently pulled him toward the door, telling him that the little girl would be very happy to know the person who had helped her, and that there was nowhere in the world he deserved to enter more than that room. And he let her lead him. They stepped into the room just as Daisy stirred softly and opened her wide eyes still shining with the same innocent brightness as always. And the first thing the little girl did when she saw her mother was smile, the smile that made up Rosa's entire world. She whispered, asking whether Mommy had kept her promise to be there when she woke up, and Rosa laughed through her tears, answering that Mommy had been there the whole time, and that she had also brought along a very special friend. Daisy turned to look at the tall man standing silently beside the bed, and with the carefree trust of a child who had never known the prejudices of adults, she held out her tiny hand and asked whether he wanted to see the picture she had drawn of the flying cat. And Lincoln Marsh, the man who had once believed he didn't deserve to step into this room, slowly crouched down beside the bed, took that small hand in his, and for the first time in many years, a real smile appeared on his face. The weeks that followed passed like a spring that had come late, but had truly come at last. Daisy recovered faster than even the doctors had predicted, her small heart now whole and beating with strong, healthy rhythms, and before long she returned to her paper and pencils, drawing smiling suns and flying cats. Except now, in her pictures, there was often a tall man standing beside mother and daughter beneath the roof of a house. The Whitmore family's custody lawsuit had been completely closed, quietly withdrawn into forgetfulness, and for the first time in 2 years, Rosa woke each morning without that constant fear that a stack of papers could steal her child from her arms. As for the old house, the place into which she had poured so many quiet mornings, it had finally been brought fully back to life. The stained walls were clean and warm again. Light poured through the windows that had once been covered in dust, and the place that had once been a forgotten house now breathed with life again, as though it had only been waiting for a pair of kind hands to wake it. One afternoon, when everything was finished, Lincoln led Rosa to stand before the house, and for the first time, he told her the truth about this place, that this was the very house where his mother had once worked, where his childhood self had once stood outside and wasn't allowed to enter, where all the pain in his life had begun. He said that for 20 years, he hadn't dared touch it, hadn't sold it, and hadn't returned to it, because it held too many things he didn't know what to do with. But now it was different. He placed a key in Rosa's palm, the key to that very house, and he said she had done what he had never been able to do all those years. She had restored life to a place that had once buried the dignity of an honest woman, and he wanted her to keep it. He wanted this place to become a real home once more. For her, for Daisy, and, if she allowed it, for him as well. Rosa held the key tightly in her hand, feeling its simple, warm weight, and she understood that what she was holding wasn't only a key that opened a door, but the door into a new life that two wounded people had rebuilt together from what had been broken. And standing there, before the porch of the house that had come back to life, with her little girl laughing and running around the yard, Rosa realized that a person's dignity had never belonged to their job or the possessions they owned, but to the way they chose to live when they had nothing left in their hands. That one small act of kindness, one choice to remain honest in the middle of hardship, could melt even a heart that had seemed turned to stone. And that sometimes what saves us isn't power or money, but one person who dares to see our worth when the whole world has turned away. If this story has touched some corner of your heart, please leave a like and share it with the people you love, so kindness can spread even farther. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day you can listen to more meaningful and captivating stories. How do you feel about Rosa and Lincoln's story? And what part of their journey moved you the most? Please leave a few lines in the comments, because we're always hoping to hear the honest feelings that come from deep within your heart. Thank you for spending your time and staying with us until the very last lines. We wish you and the people you love abundant health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.